I will leave the panelists maybe 1 or 2 minutes each to introduce themselves. Maybe starting with Eddie.
Thanks, happy to be here. My name is Eddie Tai. I am one of 2 lead partners for 500 Startups Vietnam. 500 Startups is the world's most active early stage venture capital fund based out of San Francisco. We have people in 20 different markets. We've been investing here in Vietnam for the last few years, and earlier this year announced a Vietnam-focused fund. We invest in anything tech, but fintech is one of the things that we're interested in here in Vietnam. We're wrapping up 2 deals right now, actually.
Hello everybody, and my name is Duc. I'm from FPT Ventures. We are the venture arm of FPT Corporation. So FPT is I think it's the first tech company in Vietnam has done IPO since 2006, and we do mostly the IT sectors, and we do telecommunication and education. Last year, our revenue is about $1.7 billion, and we have 30,000 employees. One of our business units is to provide the core banking maintenance and customization service to many big banks in Vietnam. And we have involved with the bank system in Vietnam since very beginning. We do a lot of projects to Vietcombank. So with the recent change on fintech, then FPT do want to play an active role in this area. And I think that I think the discussion today is great. We have a lot of information, and actually, you know that by this October, then FPT and State Bank of Vietnam also organize a kind of another event talking about the fintech, the first time in Vietnam, co-organized by the government. So I think that do hope that you guys can come and join us.
Hi, for those of you that weren't there yesterday, my name's Simon Dixon. I left investment banking in 2006 and wrote a book called Bank to the Future, which talked about fintech before fintech was a word. I spoke at the world's first Bitcoin conference in Prague, and since then I've made 42 investments in Bitcoin and fintech companies. We run a large mining farm in Iceland that mines Ether and Bitcoin, and invest in cryptocurrencies as well. We founded a platform, an online investment platform called bnktothefuture.com. And in 1 year, we've had 60 million invested in the sector, and got a community of 20,000 fintech investors. So yeah, lived this sector day in, day out, really. Haven't got too much to do with Vietnam yet. Been looking at some deals. I'd be interested to see what deals you're looking at. And a couple of experiences that might come into play in this panel is I was a founding director of the UK Crowdfunding Association and UK Digital Currency Association, and supported UK and Isle of Man in their fintech and strategies. But now just really focus I live in Hong Kong now, so.
Hi, my name is Hieu. For those you don't know about Dragon Capital, Dragon Capital is a diversified fund manager in Vietnam, 20 years old. We have 1.5 billion of assets under management. Most of it invested on the listed stock exchange. The second part of it is private capital investment. We do investment in clean technology, property, and then crowdfund. I've been with the private equity team for almost a decade now, doing investment in family business, unlisted equity. FinTech is actually a new special area of interest. I think I should get a little bit of credit for myself and the firm. Sorry, Dominic, can you turn to the website page? Yeah, so middle of last year, since people didn't know about the term FinTech, we invite a couple of people into one room sharing a breakfast to talk about FinTech. And then we established a brand called FinTech Club. You can see it over here. Can you click on that, Dominic? Yeah, so there is a group on Facebook. Thanks to that, we met Dominic and his enthusiasm in blockchain and FinTech, saying that brought all of us together today in this room. Thank you.
So an applause to the panelists. So I would like, the format, for the format of this panel, I will go through a couple questions, and maybe for each question, I will invite two of you to share your thoughts, so we can cover more questions in our short time frame. So the first question is, why fintech and investments in the fintech sector worldwide are currently booming and certainly count as one of the hottest sectors in the global investment community? Vietnam has not yet seen many investments into local fintech startups. I mean, we have a couple big deals, but certainly not. The total investment size is not a lot yet. What do you think are the reasons for this? And is it regulatory uncertainty or the quality of the startups, or is the market just not ready yet, given that the absolute majority of consumers still prefer cash payments? So maybe I start first with Eddie.
Well, you seeded a few possibilities, and it's probably all of the above. To give it a little context, I mean, everybody in here knows fintech investment has increased about 8x in the last 5 years. And after a short dip last quarter, it's back up to quarterly highs this quarter. In Asia, there's about $2.6 billion of fintech investment this past quarter. 2.4 billion of that was in China, which means 0.2 billion, 200 million was through the rest of the region. So when we say that fintech investment in Vietnam has not been as hot as certain other markets, it's probably true for a lot of other emerging markets. I think the two, I mean, there's always many factors to this, and I think the two main ones are two that you mentioned and that were talked about on the prior panel, the regulatory environment as well as consumer behavior. On the regulatory environment side, I mean, Vietnam's economy generally is very overregulated, and it's no less true for the finance sector. And the regulations are there for a reason, and I don't think the regulators are doing it to harm innovation, but they do want to try to protect how things are. And fortunately, though, in conversations that I've had with several government officials, and these guys as well have had with government officials, they do recognize the opportunities that fintech presents, but they're still learning. So, regulators in other parts of the world have set up think tanks to try to understand and adapt the regulations faster. I was fortunate enough to go to Davos earlier this year, and there was a panel with the head of the Eurogroup and Steve Schwarzman from Blackstone and Brian Moynihan from Bank of America. They echoed sentiments that I've heard from bank executives here over the last several months, which is fintech disruption is inevitable, and they didn't think it was inevitable 5 years ago, 6 years ago maybe, but it definitely is now. That's why they're starting to invest more. On the regulatory side, there's been a general observation that the regulation must continue, but it has to adapt. And but inevitably, the adaptation is going to be slower than the innovation. I think it was the Eurogroup head who said the regulation should follow innovation, not vice versa. On the consumer behavior side, I'll let somebody else dig into that more, but I mean, the challenges are there, which means the opportunity is there. What do we get, 2 million credit cards now, which is still very, very low. I think things like Momo will help shift people away from cash only. I think there's room for other opportunities as well, particularly.
Well, the history of legal framework. So we had the first bank in 1993. So the banking sector is somewhere 20 years old. And the State Bank of Vietnam is the only regulator of banking sector in Vietnam. They have more than 20 bureaus, and one of those is the Payment Bureau of Mr. Tien, who are here, that regulate payment company. So when we talked about financial services company and the regulator must work together closely, because they need to understand how do you operate, what kind of services do you offering to the market, and they need to protect the buyer, the depositor as well. So that's the first reason I think why fintech sector mostly the only payment company. The second reason should be collaboration of banks and fintech company. At the moment, they still rely on banking infrastructure in wiring money and transferring money from one account to the other. So no matter how much they innovate themselves, they still use bank infrastructure for remitting money. But lastly would be the same as the consumer behavior. People are not confident with the new term, new kind of technology and company. They don't trust a limited company providing them financial services. They trust big bank, big names, endorsed by state bank. They feel confident about those kind of traditional services.
From my point of view, and I think that actually because we just talked about the fintech terms in last year. However, if we look back to by 2005, at that time then Vietnam started to license the e-wallet, the digital payment, and you know that go out from that there are several companies that start up very successful. I know that one guy is the VN Pay. He now my neighbors, and he just bought a very big house. And you know that also I know that several like 2 or 3 guys, Movie V from the billionaire Trung Dũng, he also started with the mobile payment service, and later on he pivoted to the more than the mortgage. So I can say that it's not about like a few investment, but we can say that for the financial service in Vietnam, then we can see like several deals already, but we do not term it as a fintech. And I think that's just recently, then there's a very famous private equity firm. They also invested into a pawn shop chains in Vietnam. So I think that for the financial service in Vietnam, then more and more attention from private equity and from venture capitals. However, of course, like to reach the level of the other developed countries about like the new very like promising fintech, and we see then we not reach there. We still have to like work a lot to open the regulation and to have more innovation. But I think that is only a matter of time. Yeah.
So in terms of the actual problems of Vietnam, maybe I could just speak in a specialist area which I understand quite well, which is digital currencies. So one of the investments we made was in the largest exchange in Africa, and Africa is a very interesting user case because they went very fast from a cash economy to digital cash through the M-Pesa network, and now looking at whether Bitcoin can facilitate disruption in the M-Pesa network. The reason I think that's really interesting to people in Vietnam is actually the reason that I got into digital currencies and Bitcoin particularly in the first place, and that's because there's systemic risk in banking. And so I got into it because, and there was a question yesterday which I think is relevant here of why are you investing in Bitcoin and why is it different to banking? People were asking that question, so it's probably worth answering. Deposits. And its legal ownership is being transferred once deposited. With Bitcoin, you own your own money. So just like your cash, you own your own cash, you own your own money. The second is when deposited with a bank, it's then spent, which introduces systemic risk, because how the bank spends your money, it depends upon whether it's actually going to be reclaimed or yours or theirs in the future. And they tend to spend it on property, which pushes up property prices because people's depositors are there. With Bitcoin, it's all peer-to-peer, so you go straight from one person to another. And the final part of it is the monetary policy, how it's created. So the monetary policy of bank deposits, that's better, I think, for a bit, is that a bank deposit is created when someone borrows money. So therefore, all bank deposits are backed by debt. With Bitcoin, it introduced a new form of money creation, which is a geeky process called Bitcoin mining, but it distributes the profits amongst the users. So you have those three things, and you have systemic risk in that. So the opportunity with Vietnam is that essentially a lot of the properties that Vietnam has with cash, but you get all the benefits. So if you're looking to hedge against bank deposits, you got a choice of cash, gold, or Bitcoin at the moment. Gold is pretty hard to chip off a piece of gold and spend it. Cash is working really well in Vietnam at the moment, but the opportunity is the benefits of being able to take digital cash, where you can participate in the global market and send value anywhere in the world, not just to your local next door neighbor. And that's the opportunity that it presents. It's financial inclusion for the Vietnamese people on a scale we've never seen before. And that's the opportunity I'm excited about and why we would be exploring investing in some of the companies in Vietnam that could facilitate that movement. The process of changing consumers and users' habits is a very, very hard process. But it tends to be, it shows that it can happen really fast, like it did in Kenya, when you can give enough benefits to the financial inclusion, the potential that people have here.
Many thanks to our speakers. Yeah, I certainly read about M-Pesa case and it was a great success. I heard like 89% of Kenyan population now use digital payments through M-Pesa, something like that. So let's move on to our next question. An interesting observation may be that not many bottom-up startups in Vietnam in regard to fintech have been able to achieve any significant traction. It appears that most new solutions in fintech are more implemented top-down, which means they started by large established corporations who can leverage their customer base, their sales network, and last but not least, their vast amount of capital. Do you think we will see a change here in the coming years, or will Vietnam remain a country where innovation happens basically from the inside rather than from new upstarts challenging the incumbents? So I maybe let's start with Mr. Duc, because that'd be an interesting question.
Right. So I think that's much regarding to the FPT, because we big corporation already, and we also do a lot of innovation inside our company. And I think that, but the question I think is a two different world, because you know that as a big corporation, then usually you have to do R&D, you have to develop the new solution for your customer. So in case of FPT, when we do the service for big banks in Vietnam, then we have to talk about the new ideas and talk about the new technology to them and try to implement the new solution. But for the startup side, you know, that is more on the innovation and for experiment. We don't know what will work in the future. You cannot easily develop a solution and say, hey, banks, or hey, consumer, please use it. It takes time, so that's why we call that startups. So I think that we should separate those kind of area. So for the startup part, I think that the most important question now is how to have more and more startup doing the innovative idea in the fintech area. So to do so, then I think that you know that for the banks in Vietnam, they already aware about the fintech, aware about the threats, and I think that in the first quarter, then Vietcombank they set up their own they call digital lab. I think that's a very good movement to tap with the innovation. However, what we see is that we should have some more stronger relationship with the startup community. That's why recently then both Dragon and FPT we set up an accelerator. We set up an open-ended accelerator. We call the Vietnam Innovative Startup Accelerator. One of the area we focus is also fintech. So the idea is that we will call on for the ideas from the community, and they can present the idea to us, and we can help them with our experience, our technologies, even our customer base. We can introduce the solution to our banks in Vietnam that we have, and so we can give them seed funding for that. So that's the way we solve the issue, and we want to looking for more and more startups in Vietnam working in the fintech area.
Regarding to this perspective, maybe the audience also interested in understanding, is it true that in fintech there's certain barriers to entry that sort of forbid the smaller startups into growing in this sector? Is it why we have been observing, we've been seeing more top-down versus bottom-up startups into this area? And if that is the case, what are the solutions that we can look at or that have been successful in other countries? The accelerator you just mentioned is definitely one of the solutions that we can look at.
So I'd probably say is two things. In terms of, so I guess you've got different types of companies. There's no rule for all company. If you're doing a local solution that's targeted at local, then you're probably going to be thinking very differently to global solutions. So most of the companies we're investing in, they don't pick their jurisdiction based upon where their customer is someone that they're going to do business with on the ground. They pick their jurisdiction just based upon one thing, and that's regulations. So all the companies we're investing in, they're just picking a jurisdiction whereby the regulators are going to allow them to do what they need to do on a global scale. They're not looking to target Singapore customers. They're not looking to target US customers. They're not looking to target Vietnamese customers. They just want a supportive environment where they can set up and they don't have to fear that they're going to go to prison for doing something that they think is going to change the world and make the financial world a better place. So if you want to attract fintech startups, it's 100% at the regulatory level because the fintech startups, the people that are innovating and building on top of digital currencies and peer-to-peer lending and all these other things, they're just going to congregate to the jurisdiction which is most supportive to them. So there's a lot of economies around the world and countries around the world right now that would love 10,000, 100,000, 1 million jobs that could be created from the disruption of the traditional financial sector. And so countries like Isle of Man and UK, they said, well, we're very exposed to banking at the moment, and if this blockchain thing is going to be as big as many people think it will be, then we need to create a regulatory environment to make sure that we don't lose all our banking jobs that are migrating to blockchain for startups at the moment, and we need to create a regulatory environment to support the innovation. And so if Vietnam wants to be a player in fintech, it's just the regulatory level, and companies all around the world will come to the jurisdiction that gives them the correct regulatory environment to be able to do what they need to do. Nothing else will do it apart from if you're supporting at the local level and you have a local solution for Vietnamese cash in, cash out or something like that. The other thing is just access to funding, and that's really changing. It used to be the case that you needed to go to Silicon Valley to attract VCs. The investment in the blockchain sector in the last 7 to 8 years has been $1 billion. We've done $60 million in 1 year. That's 6% of the volume, and that's all online with no venture capitalist. So it's changing. It wouldn't have been long ago that 500 startups wouldn't have been here. They would have just been attracting Silicon Valley startups, but now they're here. They're doing accelerators. So jurisdiction in terms of access to capital is changing a lot. And that's a really positive move where, you can it's still advantageous to have an American company or a UK company or a Singapore company. But if you change these regulatory things, then Vietnam can be a jurisdiction where people come. It's up to the government. It's not really up to anything else.
I was just about to mention the incoming wave of new capital into Vietnam. I think someone mentioned this earlier, that the big corporations are better adopter new technology. In this case, for Vietnam, it's especially true because I think banks in Vietnam, they have sufficient capital and especially human resources to do new projects. However, there is another debate between a venture building between large corporation banks versus the efficiency in the startup, especially fintech startup. I think that will be changing, not also because of new capital, but also because of a wave of talent coming on from overseas educations. A couple of years ago, when we look at demographic of Vietnam, we see majority of it, like more than 50% below 25 years old. Below 25 years old means you don't have experience, you don't have money, so there is no market to deploy such a cheaper solution for financial services. But now it is the median is 31, which means you have sufficient experience, you have sufficient of capital, you can start your own new ideas.
See, that's very interesting because in countries like UK and America, certainly the innovation does not come at the corporate level. It comes from a deliberate strategy of acquiring fintech startups. So in the West, the banks are not doing the innovation. They're saying, look, we've got our strategy that's working. We don't want to take risk. We don't want to rock the boat with the regulators. So you guys create something. You create peer-to-peer lending. You create apps. You create all this stuff. And if you get any traction, we'll acquire you either to eliminate you or to gobble you up into something that we're doing. So in the West, it's corporate venturing that's and fintech is doing the innovation. So it's really interesting to hear that the innovation has been done at the corporate level because they have the resource. So it seems a flip.
I would say it's innovation is being attempted at the corporate level. Is it actually happening there? Not so much. The banks are making progress in their digital offerings, but it's not what we would consider innovative. It's not just completely different from anything that people have seen before. They're just looking, oh, hey, Bank of America and Citibank, they have these great digital online platforms, we should do the same thing. Or, hey, there's a branchless bank in the US, we could probably do the same thing over here. And so these are being launched by folks with deep pockets because it does take money to run. The frustrating thing I see about these top-down approaches is that they're burning a ton of capital, and they're thinking about it as work for their own client base. They're not developing things that could cut across all institutions, or they're not thinking about it that way. Whereas I think, I mean, for example, we'll step back decades, credit cards, if only one bank in the US supported Visa, Visa would not be the global credit card player. Visa is successful because so many people from institutions issuing to merchants accepting, they all buy in to using Visa. And they're all accepted to be using Visa. But here in Vietnam, so far I see a lot of the banks thinking about innovation as saying, this is how I'm going to get market share from my competitors if I develop something in-house, and et cetera, et cetera. So I do think there will be an evolution here in Vietnam towards what we see in the West. But even that said, like it's not to insult the banks here. It took a long time for the U.S. banks to realize this as well, that they just can't do everything in-house on their own. There's too much regulation, there's too much bureaucracy, the cash burn becomes too much. Why do all of that instead of when you can just kind of seed? You can even seed some startups around, or you wait for which startup is going to win, and then you can come in and even bring some of the other banking partners and kind of support the one that seems to be taking off. So that's on that. On the consumer side, I wanted to go back to that because I do think, so a lot, when I think a lot of us on this panel, when we think about fintech startups here in Vietnam, we're not necessarily aiming at global. We are thinking about geographic areas, so whether it's Vietnam or maybe Southeast Asia. And so towards that, it's not necessarily about taking down all barriers, which I think most of us on this panel would agree would take a very, very long time here in Vietnam to catch up to Isle of Man or somewhere else. But there are incremental improvements in the regulation that can allow for fintech startups in partnership with banks to target the unbanked or the underbanked. But to do that, there's a lot of work to be done on the consumer education. And it's education, it's also assurance programs as well. So the example I would use that's relevant to Vietnam is e-commerce in Vietnam 6-7 years ago didn't really exist until we came up with a couple of applications here that one wouldn't consider innovative on its own sense, but altogether was enough to kick off e-commerce for the next several years. One of those was cash on delivery, as opposed to prepayment. Another one was allowing the delivery to be returned at no cost. these seem obvious now to those of us who are living here and operating in the digital space, but those didn't come about till 5 or 6 years ago. And when actually some of my friends realized that to overcome trust issues, there has to be a gradual long-term development in trust, but in the short term there are product and service nuances that can be built in to help overcome these things. So just to add a little local context to your comments. But I totally agree, like it's innovation from young, scrappy teams is, in my opinion, inevitably going to be more successful in the long run. These top-down startups that are being developed by big private equity funds or banks, they're plowing in $5 or $10 million before they even have 10,000 customers. It makes it impossible for any venture capital to come in. There's a disconnect between the shareholder structure and the kind of management structure as well. Often the CEO is not the majority shareholder of these things. So when VC investors look at these kinds of startups, we are considered about the long-term incentives alignment. I think there will be a gradual migration towards the Western model.
Thanks. We seem to have a diverse pool of opinions here. So let's move on to the next question. Eddie mentioned trends and what will happen in the future. So in regard to the quality of the fintech startups in Vietnam, how would you rank the ecosystem in comparison to other nations in Southeast Asia? And specifically for the future, I wonder what the panelists think about the trends that will happen in the next 5 or 10 years for the fintech sector in Vietnam.
Right now, I think we're pretty behind compared to the rest of the region, especially Singapore, which is positioning to be the financial capital of Southeast Asia. They already are the financial capital of Southeast Asia, so they're well positioned to develop and roll these things out. But even the Philippines and Indonesia are seeing a lot of scale in their fintech startups that are targeting consumers at least. So, and those startups are starting to enter the market here, and fortunately 500 Startups has invested in some of those already. Will that change? I think inevitably it must. Don't hold me to that, but for the kinds of investments that we're looking I'm talking about, which are the local, regional style investments that focus on specific consumers and so on. Understanding the consumer is really important. Understanding the local regulation is really important, and those differences between Vietnam and other parts of the region are going to continue. So even with the kind of bank integration in the region that's coming on right now, so that will give the space for fintech startups to arise in the region, in the country, excuse me. And hopefully they can do that fast enough to start to be competitive on the regional level. But in terms of comments about the next 5 or 10 years, that's about as far as I'm willing to go. I'm always afraid of predicting the future. If I were good at it, I would probably be doing something else besides this.
So I think that, agree with Eddie about current stage. Then the fintech startup in Vietnam is still very few compared to the other region. I think that maybe it's also because of the history problem. By 2008, then Vietnam's allowed the people to open a bank very easily. And that's also caused a lot of problem to the economy. And later on, then the government become more and more cautious on the financial sector. So they don't want to really open minded anymore. Want to more control. And I think that also cause a problem for the fintech startups. But also I think it's not only fintech startup, but when we're working with the startup ecosystem in general, it's the same. To solve this, I think that we need two ways. So we need to seek the understanding between the both sides, government sectors and startup sectors. And FPT, we want to be a bridge on that. So we are organizing a lot of conference between the startup ecosystem and government. And I see that from government side, and the top leaders are very, very, I think that's supportive. And I think that they also very smart to understand Just yesterday, I met with the president of Hanoi government, and he understands every problems in the startup ecosystem. And he also point out that there are several issues need to solve. However, you know that for Vietnam, then to solve a legal issue, then you need to follow the process. That's why it's not like easily you can just not can change the things like just after one day. But I think that things very positive now. The government want to hear the voice from the startup, from because you know that Vietnamese now need a lot of innovation. Also, you know that Prime Minister, they just decided that by 2020, so 5 years, Vietnam need to have 1 million private companies. Now it's 500,000. So one solution for that, I heard from the president of Hanoi yesterday, is that they convert the family business into the companies. So for the family business, which has like 5 employees, then we encourage to become a companies, private companies. Those kind of solution open a very big area, big market for funding SME. So I think that if we can do some kinds of maybe solution to fund for the SME sectors, but you know that the SME sector is not served well by the current banking system now. You know, it's very hard for a family to like make a loan from a bank with if they do not have like assets. So usually they have assets, then they can make a loan. But if they do not have, then they cannot. So the bank doesn't give the loan to the projects. So if we can create some kind of like platform that make that process easier, then I think it's also very potential for Vietnam market.
So if there are influential people in the room that are going to be deciding on Vietnam's future after this conference, then I'd probably say there's 3 directions, and you're going to pick one of these directions. The first direction you might go with is you might continue your existing path and continue with cash being the predominant way of medium of exchange. If you do that, my guess and my forecast for the next 5 years is that Singapore and Hong Kong will create fintech innovation, and they'll start serving and having a significant impact upon your monetary policy through whatever fintech innovation they come up with, and people will either adopt it or they'll continue with cash. The second option they could take is they could go for a cashless society. This would be the worst option you could go for. A cashless society means that you adopt the Western model of going towards everyone moving towards bank deposits, and bank deposits have systemic risk that the West are about to experience on a scale we haven't seen a lot larger than 2007, 2008. So if you want the society to move towards a banking monetary policy, then I'd suggest that would be the worst option. The first option would be best. Or the third option is rather than cashless society or continuing as is and allowing the innovation to happen in another region, would be that you start looking at other asset classes like blockchain and what's coming out of here. And there might be the opportunity that you do the innovation internally. The challenge with that is what I said before. You'd have to create the perfect jurisdiction to attract the startups from around the world in order to come here, much like they're kind of doing at Singapore at the moment. And then you can internalize all that. And you have the opportunity to be the next Wall Street, the next London, because we believe that blockchain and fintech is about to disrupt a multi-trillion-dollar sector in the banking sector. And it's up to Vietnam whether they want to be a part of that or not, or whether they're even positioned to do that, or whether they want to focus on other things. But in terms of finance, there's 3 options. Stay as is, allow the innovation to happen next door. Go to a cashless society, which will introduce Western banking and systemic risk, which would be a really bad move. or start looking at whether you can digitize cash and start embracing blockchain and alternative technologies that have the benefits of cash, but all of the properties that allow you to play on a global scale in finance. That will be a decision, or that decision will be made for you. It's up to you.
Well, 5 years, difficult to say. I just want to quickly add one trend in my observation about fintech in specific and in tech startup in general. They going regional. We look at investment here, investment in Thailand, and a couple recent one. We see the level of technology, the size of the problem that they're trying to solve are equally significant. But other country like Singapore or Thailand, when the founder start a company, they think regional, they think about doing multi-market. But here in Vietnam, they think about problem within the country domestically for the moment. I think for the last couple of years has been the period for startup in Vietnam to show the proof of capability, and then the next couple of years is the time for them to bring those capability to scale up and really go regional, make the company bigger.
Okay, so please give applause for our panelists today. I think we will, our time is running short, so we probably don't have time for another question. We move on to the next panel.